Hey everyone, welcome to April Meetup Cycles Group Sri Lanka, and today we are going to discuss about unicorn, and we welcome its founder Kam, who gave us his valuable time to and his early morning time for this presentation. Kam, you can take the control.
All right. Thank you very much for having me. So let's talk about Unicorn, and in this case, we're going to integrate it with Sitecore Habitat as well. At the request of Robert Hawk, who's one of the organizers of SUGCon Europe, he wanted me to make a note at the front of my presentation that SUGCon Europe is coming up on the 25th and 26th of April. It is a tech conference in Copenhagen, and it's a community-driven conference. It's a great opportunity to see some of the best technical minds in the Sitecore community presenting on interesting topics. I will be there, and I am really excited about a lot of the sessions. I wish I could clone myself so I could see all of them, actually. And there are tickets still available. If anyone can make it, you can sign up at sugcon.eu. So let's talk about Unicorn. What is Unicorn? Because I'm not sure everybody necessarily knows that. Unicorn is a tool that is designed to solve the problem of moving Sitecore database items between instances. So if you're doing development and you're trying to push things around, Unicorn is a tool that is designed to make that awesome instead of frustrating. Unicorn lets you treat the Sitecore database items as files and use those files along with source control to push them to other Sitecore installations. So why do we need something like this? Suppose you're doing a really common thing in Sitecore. You're creating a new rendering. In order to make that rendering, you need to have a file for your markup, probably a razor view if you're using Sitecore MVC. And then you also need to have an item in the database to register that view with Sitecore so that you can add it to pages, and then that same item is referenced by pages that have that rendering. And so you need, in order to successfully deploy your rendering to multiple servers, which your local dev is not live, obviously, you need to be able to push them in a reliable fashion. So what we want to do is we want to be able to have our source control commits be complete with both the item that is necessary to make the rendering work and the view, which is a file already that is necessary. And so that's what Unicorn lets you do. So how does Unicorn work? There are a lot of other serialization tools out there. Unicorn is a little bit more prescriptive than other serialization tools, which means that it has its own idea of the way that serialization should work. If you're willing to do things its way and treat the files on disk as literally the master copy and the database as sort of the result of those files, the reward is that Unicorn can handle the vast majority of item merging. Unicorn accomplishes this by automatically writing changes you make in Sitecore to serialized files on disk as you make the changes, almost like an event handler, but it's actually a data provider. That means that when you pull item changes from other developers, your source control system actually does the first shot at merging the remote changes within the already up-to-date files on your disk. In this way, we can take advantage of the automatic file merging capabilities of modern source control systems, such as Git, to take care of simple item merges if two people have edited the same item, so that we don't have to manually make that choice, a lot of times on content that somebody else has authored and we don't know what the correct result of the merge is. So if you've got the files on disk as the master, how do we get, like if I pull code from somebody else and it has new items in it, how do we get that into our Sitecore database and use those updates? Because there's no point in getting updates if you can't actually see them inside of Sitecore and use them. That's actually the pretty awesome part. You don't have to do anything at all. Unicorn has a feature called transparent sync that literally is watching the file system as when Sitecore either starts up or when you change something after Sitecore started up, and it will automatically pull changed serialized items right into Sitecore instantly. So you pretty much can just pull somebody else's code and then run it, and probably running a build as well. But you can just run that, and their items will automatically show up inside of your Sitecore content tree without doing anything. That also means that you can really easily, if you're using Unicorn for deployments, whether to development or production, you can easily revert a failed deployment by just taking the last version that you deployed and syncing the last version's files, serialized files, and your templates and everything have been reverted back to the way they were before the deploy happened. So I know I talked about merging. Merge conflicts are definitely a pain point traditionally among developers, and nobody likes doing merge conflicts, but unfortunately they happen sometimes, no matter what. But not all kinds of merge conflicts are hard to deal with. The less understandable the file being merged, the greater chance of failing the merge, and with that, perhaps breaking the build, and potentially also corrupting your database or who knows what else. So Unicorn has a file system that I spent probably about a year developing that is called Rainbow. It is an alternative serialization format to the default Sitecore serialization format that is used by other serialization tools, such as if you're using the developer tab in Sitecore or if you're using TDS. Rainbow is designed as a direct reaction to issues merging that format. And it is designed to be readable and understandable by humans. And let's take a look at an example of that. So if you look at the stock multi-list, which is the Sitecore serialization format on the right, you can see that there is a content length, there is redundant data between the name and the key, and the list of item IDs, this is a multi-list here, so it's storing links to several items, are all stored on a single line that are pipe delimited. If there is any kind of change made by two people to this field, it's automatically going to create a merge conflict because merge tools operate on a line-based basis, because that list of GUIDs is going to be different, and then the merge tools will not know how to merge a single line that has been changed by two different developers. As well, there's that content length there. Even if you have a merge conflict and you manually resolve it, if you don't manually recalculate that content length afterwards and then fix it to be the exact correct length, that file will be corrupted and it will not work correctly when you try to push it into Sitecore. Rainbow, on the other hand, you can see on the left, actually stores it using a YAML-based format. And YAML is a language that was developed originally to make human-readable config files. And so in YAML, we've adapted the way that we store the multi-list so that it has one GUID per line. So you could actually have somebody add another GUID to this base template between the first and second one. Somebody else adds it between the second and third one. And you would actually have Git be able to merge that without even asking, like it would just work. And that's not the only thing it does. So layouts are another good example of this. Again, it gets rid of the content length with your stock layout. And it also pretty prints the XML of the layouts, including even putting the attributes of the rendering includes on their own line, which means that you can actually even have merge conflicts automatically resolve, if possible, between a specific rendering, like if somebody changes the placeholder or something like that. So Unicorn is very easy to merge compared with standard Sitecore serialization. There are a whole bunch of other things about it, like how it doesn't require very specific line endings. So if you're using Git, you may be familiar with having to add a Git attributes file and tell it specifically how to handle .item files. That's not required with Unicorn. In fact, Unicorn even understands very old school Mac OS 9 style line endings, because there's actually a content item in the core database that uses that kind of line endings. So let's actually do a demo of Unicorn. We're going to today make a habitat feature. And a habitat feature is, let me share my VM here. Let's see. Here we go. So I hope everybody can see my virtual machine. We have got a copy of Habitat set up here.
Yeah, can see.
Okay. We've got a copy of Habitat set up here. It's completely default. This is Habitat as of like 3 days ago, cloned from GitHub. So if we essentially do, we've got a additional feature of Habitat on here called a yeoman generator. Yeoman is a utility that is designed to generate new projects or new features within a project. It's a Node.js project. I implemented a yeoman generator for Habitat that lets you actually install Habitat with a couple of commands at the command line, but it also lets you add features to Habitat, which is normally a bit of a tedious process. And so we're actually going to use that to make a feature right now. So what you do is you type yo habitat : feature. And when you do that, it will generate for you a new feature in your habitat. You have to tell it what you want, and we're going to make the most requisite feature of any site that is running on Habitat Giphy. We're not going to make tests because, yeah, not a short amount of time. And we are going to use transparent sync, which is what I was talking about Unicorn being able to automatically pull changes from disk in real time. So if you just hit enter, all it does is it goes and creates a bunch of files. There's some templating involved so that it sets the project up to have a unique GUID. It generates a serialization config for you, which we're going to go look at. It generates the project files for you. So we will go in here in Habitat, and hopefully people are a little bit familiar with Habitat, or at least its architecture. In Habitat, the idea is that you'd have a feature, which is a isolated unit of functionality that, like an FAQ page, or there's other things in here, FAQs, media, navigation, and they all are designed to be isolated from each other so that they are easily mobile between projects. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and add the feature that we got generated here, the Giphy feature. So in Habitat, a feature is a specific setup where you've got code and serialization right next to each other. There'd also be tests here if there was that. In this case, code is where we actually are storing the project file. This is all Habitat standard stuff, not Unicorn. So here's the CS project we generated for Giphy. And so we can take this and go take a look at the serialization configuration, because the first thing you have to do when you're using Unicorn is you have to tell it what exactly you want to serialize. So in this case, what we've got here is a configuration. And in Unicorn, you can have as many configurations as you want. In the case of Habitat, every feature has its own configuration because it's isolated from the other features. And you specify, this is the most important part here, the predicate. The predicate specifies what items in Sitecore you want that Unicorn configuration to include, because Unicorn does not process every Sitecore item. That's not really what you want, because as we mentioned earlier, the disk is the master. So you don't actually want the disk being the master for, say, content items in most cases, because if you have a content editor go and edit a content item on production and you're syncing content using the standard setup, it's actually going to undo their changes to that content because it's going to set the disk back to being the master, and they're not a developer committing new things to the source control for serialized items. So this kind of setup right here is really designed for developer artifacts that would be flowing in one direction from a developer's development environment up to a production content or a development server, or being shared between developers. It's not designed to store everything. There's some things you can do with what's called the new items only evaluator for doing content, but just keep in mind that with the default settings, you don't want to serialize content if you are expecting content editors to not have their changes be overwritten. So in this case, we are including just very standard templates and renderings. In this case, the feature has its own folder for templates and renderings inside of Sitecore. And so what we are going to do is build, since we made a Giphy feature, we also are going to want to make a Giphy rendering. And if we go back here to Habitat, the first thing we actually need to do is publish this project so that the serialization configuration is deployed. And Habitat sets up all that stuff for you. So now we're deployed and published. And now if I go here and load up the feature under renderings and the feature under templates, once Sitecore starts up, this will take a second because doing that deploy stopped its app pool. So you can see that we've got this Giphy item here. We did not add this item. This item is actually from an item on disk that we added as part of this Giphy feature. We can go look at it actually here under serialization. You can see we have those two includes in the predicate called renderings and templates. Well, they map to an actual folder on disk right here. And we can actually go and see, so here's the Giphy item that we added under renderings. We can actually go look at what that looks like in Sublime text here, because it's just YAML. If I can actually successfully resize my window here, hopefully. There. So it's really simple. It just contains all the metadata about the item. It's somewhat of a smart format in that it does not serialize fields that it doesn't need to have. So it's not serializing, for example, the revision field. It is not synchronizing by default last updated by or last updated date, because it's assumed that because the disk is the master, you should be able to figure that out based on revisions in your source control. That also prevents you from having spurious, not really changes, commits going on to your source control. Whenever somebody touches an item, it's not actually adding a new change to source control. That all it is changing the modified date, because Sitecore does that a lot. If you're changing the template editor, for example, actually touches every item under the template when you save it, and that results in a lot of item changes that really don't do anything useful. So it does not by default serialize modified date. So if we go back here into Sitecore, what we're going to do is we're going to create a really simple component that renders Giphy. So to start with, we're going to need a data source template. We'll call it Giphy. In Habitat, you usually prefix the data source templates with an underscore. And so we'll add a content field here. We'll call it Giphy query, because what we're going to do is actually use the Giphy API to pull a random GIF based on a query. If you've used Sitecore Slack, you've probably seen a lot of people use the /Giphy command, which is either beloved or hated, depending on your perspective, but this essentially is replicating that. So we've got a data source template. Now we need a rendering. We'll add these. We need a view rendering. We will call it Giphy. And then in order to make our, well, first of all, we need to set up the pathing here. So it's going to be views, Giphy, because in Habitat, you have a folder for your feature name underneath the views folder. And then we'll just have Giphy.cshtml. And then in order to make this a component, we also need to set the data source template and the data source location. We're just going to put it right underneath the context page for now, because that's the easiest thing to do, which is a data source location of /. And then we'll set the data source template to the template we just created. So templates feature Giphy _ Giphy. We'll save that. And now that is a rendering that has a data source. And what we need to complete that whole thing is we actually need to have a view. But first, let's go take a look at our source control, because I've got this whole thing under Git. This is the GitHub desktop application, and it lets us go take a look at the changes that have been made since we created this. So there's a whole bunch of things, that are related to the feature edition, like all of the CS proj files, its web.config files. But you can also see that for all of the items we just created, so here's our rendering item. You can see it's got its data source template set, it's got its path set, its data source location set. We've got our Giphy template that has base templates. It has created bys. It's got on the template fields itself for the Giphy query, you see it's got the type of single line text. So all of the changes that we just made to Sitecore were automatically written to disk as soon as we made them. And that doesn't just work with... It's got on the template fields itself for the Giphy query, you see it's got the type. Does somebody have a question? Okay, it sounded like somebody just got unmuted, so I'll just continue. So what we've got here is essentially serialized what we've got just changed in Sitecore. If this also works for ads, it works for renames, it works for moves. It also works if you're moving something from a path that is not included in Unicorn into a path that is included in Unicorn. Pretty much all of those edge cases are handled at this point by Unicorn. And so you can pretty much go about your development, and your item changes, as long as you've got your includes set up correctly, will just show up as part of your source control commit, and you can go from there. So let's go here in Visual Studio, because the last thing we need is actually a view implementation. So we'll go under Views and Giphy, and the Yeoman generator automatically created the Giphy root item for us to give us a hint as to where we should put it. So we'll just create our view. And I'm going to steal a bunch of source code that I wrote here. This code is actually almost intentionally using a lot of anti-patterns. It has an empty catch block. It's doing really evil things and doing logic in the view, but essentially it ends up querying the Giphy API for a Giphy setup. So what we need to do now is actually, we'll use a feature of Habitat here. Habitat uses a build system that is based in Gulp, which is a Node.js task runner system. And so there are a bunch of handy tasks you can use to execute. In this case, I'm going to use auto publish views here. And start it, that essentially starts a file watcher process, which you can sort of see here that it has started a Gulp task, and it's running still, so it's just sitting there waiting for something to happen. So what we're going to do is I'll add a space to my view here and save it. Hypothetically speaking. Okay, maybe not. We'll just use publish all views then. The watcher was working last night, but it does not appear to be this time. So we will terminate the auto publish views and instead use publish all views, which will just copy all the CSHTMLs out, because all we need to do is get this CSHTML we just made to the web root. So at this point, we have our rendering ready. The last thing we need to do is add it to allowed placeholder settings so that we can actually insert it in the experience editor. We're going to put it in a placeholder it normally wouldn't be in, just because it's the simplest place to put it in Habitat, called narrow content. And then we'll look under feature, Giphy, add that, save this. And this is also serialized by default in Habitat. If you're wondering if something is serialized or not, just take a look at the content editor warnings. Right here you can see this item is controlled by Unicorn. And so that one is part of a Unicorn configuration. It will tell you the configuration name, project.common.website. So if you're trying to figure out, well, what configuration included this. Similarly, if we go look at our Giphy item, it says this item is included by transparent sync, so you can tell if it's transparently synced or if it's just regularly synced. In terms of the difference between the two, Transparent sync reads directly from the disks, and it can make things that are not actually in the Sitecore database appear in the content tree of the Sitecore database. For example, this one, you can see here it says item does not exist in the Sitecore database. This is actually the whole metadata of this folder is being read from that serialized item file. It's not actually, if you went and looked in the item table in the Sitecore database, it would not exist there. It's just being pulled in by Unicorn automatically. For regular sync, like is being used for section navigation, and Habitat by default is using regular sync. Essentially, you can make changes to disk as much as you want, but you have to sync those changes manually by telling it to run a sync in order to pull the state of the disk into the state in Sitecore. So what we're going to do now that we've got this rendering already is we're going to make a sample page, just like all the other Habitat features have. We'll call it Giphy. We're going to put that under Home, Modules, Features, and we're going to go into the Experience Editor and edit that page, and then we'll add our Giphy rendering to it. And this is using the Giphy random API, so something random might show up here. Hopefully nothing bad. If you've used Giphy on Sitecore Slack, you know that Giphy's queries are not necessarily always relevant seeming to any actual humans. So we're adding to this narrow section, and you can see we've got our Giphy rendering here. If you want to have your editors have a nice user experience, you should create a thumbnail for each of those renderings so it's much more obvious what they are. So since we set the data source template and the data source item, it pops up the select associated content dialog here, and it's asking us to create a data source item for this. In this case, we set the parent to be the current page, so it's actually going to create a child of the current page, and we'll have it set that. Once this loads up, we will have a random Giphy that the default query is set to be cats, so let's change it to dog, say, and save it. It will go out and hit the Giphy API, and now it's pulling in a random dog GIF. And every time you refresh this page, it'll be different because it's using the Giphy random API. This is definitely something that you want for your website. It's extremely useful, and every Sitecore site should totally have this right on its homepage, right? Right? So we've got all this stuff done. We've done some real actual Sitecore development here and made a very essential feature. So what we want to do is we want to take this and share it with somebody else. So we're going to start by just committing it, all the changes that we've made. You should always look over your changes before you commit them just to make sure that there's nothing you shouldn't be committing in them. So for example, here's our placeholder change, placeholder settings change. What we're going to do is just commit this and say, hello, do not write commit message like this. Because you should be writing a commit message that actually tells what happened, that we made a Giphy rendering. But we're being silly today. So now we've got this commit made, and we're going to take a short sojourn back to the presentation, and then we will come back. All right, now we're back to the presentation. So the next thing that you want to do after you've got your development done is you need to share it with somebody else, because nobody's working on a dev team of one these days, and even if you were working as a dev team of one person, you would still have to be deploying your development changes to a development environment. You'd have to be deploying it to production. And so you need a way to share the item changes that you make with somebody else. And in Unicorn, there are several ways to do that. We kind of talked about transparent sync. We talked a little bit about traditional sync. We'll do a traditional sync in a minute in the next demonstration. And the last thing is, if you're using transparent sync, you can also do a traditional sync on those transparent sync items, and that will actually make sure all of them are written to the database. The reason why that's really useful is, in general, even if you're using transparent sync for development, you should probably use a traditional sync for deployment. so that you've got everything physically written to the database. In the case of disk corruption or anything like that, you don't want to lose your transparent sync items because again, if you delete the item on disk, it's going to disappear from the content tree immediately. So if you're using a traditional sync process for deployment, that will work out good for you, and a traditional sync or a transparent sync for development works really nicely. So talking a little bit about deployments, Unicorn has a couple of options. The most useful one is that it comes with a PowerShell module. This is a regular old PowerShell module. It does not require Sitecore PowerShell to run, though Sitecore PowerShell is awesome and you should check it out. The PowerShell module that comes with Unicorn is designed to give you a single commandlet that lets you execute a sync, a traditional sync, against a remote Sitecore instance. So the way that your deployment process would normally work if you were using this for continuous integration would be that you would deploy your serialized item files, the YAML files, with your Sitecore site to the environment you were deploying to, and then you would use the PowerShell module to make a call and do a synchronization of those items after you had copied them. That way you're taking your database on your site that you're deploying to and then telling it to be identical to the expected state of your Unicorn items that were deployed with your continuous integration, continuous deployment, whatever you want to use. But use an automated deploy. They're awesome. So let's go and do a quick demonstration of kind of how a continuous integration setup would work. With Sitecore, we're not actually using a continuous integration. We're just going to do one of the PowerShell-based syncs because everybody seems to like to do continuous integration a little bit differently. So I'm going to drop back into my virtual machine here. If Hangouts would cooperate. Hang on. All right, we're back into our virtual machine. We just made our commit here to our branch, and you can see here in Git, we're using this demo-based branch. We're using a feature branch workflow here. We actually have got a second setup in parallel. So we've got base habitat and we've got CI habitat, which I can totally draw on the screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to open this Git bash here on the CI habitat, assuming we can make the window a good size here. There we go. So you can see if I show the remote, so this is actually the origin of this CI repository is actually the base repository that we were just working on. So if I do a git pull, it's actually going to pull the commit we just made across into the CI repository. So now we've taken the Giphy changes that we made and we've pulled them into CI. If you're doing a normal CI setup, this would be something the CI server would do for you, pulling your changes to whatever branch is your integration branch. And so what we need to do now is go and open Visual Studio on this CI solution so that we can run a build, which is what your CI would normally do for you. But in this case, since we're not actually using a real CI server, we kind of have to do it ourselves. So we need to hang on while it loads up, which Habitat takes a while to get started because it's got, I think, like 40 projects in it by default. And if you're doing new features, each feature adds 2 to 3 projects, depending on what you're doing. So it takes a bit to get spun up. While we're doing that, we can actually go have a look at the way that this sync operates. Habitat has the ability to actually execute this PowerShell as a gulp task. So you can actually execute the sync unicorn task in Sitecore, but it's using a slightly modified version of what comes with Unicorn itself. If you go to the Git repository in the documentation folder, there is these sample scripts that include the PowerShell module and this sample script. The sample script essentially gives you the commands that you need, which is literally just these 2 lines. You just import the unicorn module, and then that adds this sync unicorn commandlet. That lets you synchronize unicorn using a traditional sync wherever you want to do it, as long as you have this shared secret. The shared secret is set in the unicorn config files. You should use something very long and very random for that, because it allows you to execute syncs. It doesn't really let you edit the state of your Sitecore instance because you can't deploy new files to it, but it does let you execute syncs, which could potentially be a denial of service if somebody decided to start spamming them. So what we've got is, now that this is loaded up, we should have our Giphy feature, which we do. We're going to go and publish this so that we've got the configuration files on this. You can see here we've got ci.habitat as our publish target and not the base habitat we were using. So once this has finished publishing, now we've got the configurations up there. What we're going to do is we're actually going to load up a PowerShell here. And then we'll actually execute a sync in this particular configuration, the Giphy configuration that we did. So what we're going to do is import the module. And that gives us the ability to use the sync unicorn commandlet. And I hit tab too early. You can, PowerShell has automatic command completion, so you can just hit tab and it will actually find loaded commandlets. It's kind of awesome. And it can actually infer the parameters to them. So if I type in C here and hit tab, it knows that control panel URL is a parameter to sync unicorn. So what I'm going to do is http ci.habitat. We're using a local hosts file here /unicorn.aspx. And we're going to pass the shared secret parameter. I've got the shared secret already here in Sublime, so I can just grab it and paste it. And then there's an optional third parameter. If you don't pass configurations, it will actually sync everything. In this case, syncing everything might take a little bit, so we're actually going to tell it to sync only the feature. I can type feature.giphy. You don't actually have to use, in this case, the array syntax, which is the parentheses. If you do that, you can synchronize multiple configurations at once. In this case, we're just going to do one, and then we just hit enter. It does a challenge response hash-based authentication setup with that shared secret. So the shared secret never actually is transferred over the wire. Only the caller and the server know about it, and it generates a signature challenge based on its shared secret. So you should still use it over SSL, but it's a heck of a lot better than just pushing the shared secret if you don't have SSL. So now it's created the authentication, and it's executing the synchronization of this configuration, and it's done. If we go up and look through the logs here of PowerShell, it's telling us what it did, and essentially all of these A's is adding something. So it went and added the Giphy feature, it went and added the template up here, it went and added the rendering here, it went and added the well, it looks like it loaded the template down here, and then it automatically published all those. So at this point, if you, and the auto publish is an important note, it's there by default. If you are publishing content for some reason, like there are situations where you want to actually publish content, workflow does apply. So if it tries to auto publish something that's in draft, it's not actually going to publish it. But if you have something that is approved in workflow that you're pushing, it will actually auto publish that. Most of the time, you probably do want it to auto-publish your templates. It's a fairly efficient form of auto-publishing. It uses the publish queue and manually puts only the items that it is syncing that have changed onto that publish queue, so it runs fairly quickly. But be aware that it's there. If you don't like it, there's a config file that you can use to turn it off. It's a pipeline-based thing, then you can just get rid of it. So now we've synced our Giphy features in, but the last thing we have to do here, we're going to load up the Unicorn control panel, which is at /unicorn.aspx. We have to sign into a Sitecore as an administrator to use it. Anyone want to take a guess at what the admin password is for this Sitecore instance? Perhaps an early letter of the alphabet? Obviously, don't do that in production. In fact, make that the first thing you change when you start a new Sitecore project. So this is the Unicorn control panel. It shows you all of your configurations that have been registered. So this is almost kind of like a Sitecore admin show config for your Unicorn setup. You can go and see the details of each individual one. So for example, if I hit show config here under the Giphy feature, it will show me exactly what is going on. Each of these items that is being shown is actually a dependency. So each Sitecore configuration is almost like an IOC container. If you look at the defaults node in unicorn.config, there are a whole bunch of dependencies that it uses. You can actually grab any of those nodes and override them. So if you want to change the way things are serialized, if you want to change the behavior when a sync happens, you can totally do that on a per configuration basis by tapping in a different evaluator. So let's close that up. What we need to do once we're in here is we need to go and grab the project.habitat.website configuration. The reason we need to sync this particularly is because it contains the Giphy sample page, which is not transparent sync. And so this is a way that we can see what happens when you execute a synchronization for items that are in a different configuration using manual traditional sync. You can see here that we added the Giphy modules. And so once that finishes doing all of its syncing, we can go and load up our CI habitat site. Because now we've basically done all of the synchronization that is necessary to pull our Giphy module in, as well as its sample page. So if we navigate here to the feature, you can see that it's actually pulled our Giphy feature into the habitat list that we added, all by Unicorn. And on top of that, we've got it loading up a dog, because if you remember, we set the sample query to dog in the last, when we were doing it in the site we were building from, and we're not actually signed in to this site, so we're not doing preview or anything. So you can see that the auto publish actually worked because all these pages are actually published and visible. Kind of neat. So there is some basic habitat development with Unicorn. I'm going to flip back to the presentation for a second here. Did people have any questions so far? I guess a lot of people can't actually talk right now, so that's kind of a silly question. After this, I would be happy to take questions for people who can't talk on the Unicorn Slack channel. So if you are on Slack, we can easily take questions from there. So in summary, why should you use Unicorn? It'll save you a lot of time because you don't have to think about what items to serialize. You basically just have to look at your source controls commit dialog and see what things you should push into it. It'll reduce bugs because you're very easily and simply keeping your serialized database items along with your code, and so it becomes much less likely that you'll forget something, especially compared with using packages. It adds a lot of reliability to your deployments because it means that you're deploying a very well-known database state. It's used by MVPs, it's used by Sitecore Habitat. It's free and open source. There are lots of community contributions that are part of Unicorn. And the development process for it is completely transparent. I do not have any private repository for Unicorn. I use the commits that I make to Unicorn on a daily basis. I use my own NuGet packages as part of my daily development process, and so there's nothing hidden going on there. If anybody has questions, feel free to ask them in Unicorn on Slack. I'll drop the presentation here in a second so that we can more easily do that. And thank you very much. Unicorn is a NuGet package. All you have to do if you want to use it is go and grab it off of NuGet. There's a README file that it'll pop up after you install that tells you some next steps of what you can do. It's open source on GitHub. I'm basically Kamsar just about everywhere, so you can find me at kamsar.net, Kamsar on Twitter, Kamsar on GitHub, and if you've got Unicorn questions, the best place to ask them is to get on Sitecore Community Slack and ask in the Unicorn channel. Even if I'm not there, there are a lot of smart people who hang out in there, and they can answer a lot of common Unicorn questions. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Kam. There are a lot of people, but they are not joining into the live call. So yeah, they can ask questions from the channel. Dinanka, do you have any questions? Cannot hear you, Dinanka.
Hi, Chadran.
Yeah, hi.
Can you hear me?
So there's a question on Unicorn. What is the performance of Unicorn compared with standard Sitecore serialization? The answer to that is it's actually sizably faster. Unicorn was significantly optimized in testing when Unicorn 3 first came out. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% faster than standard Sitecore serialization. It does optimize the way that it talks to the disk. It really does like solid-state drives, though. If you've got solid-state drives, your performance will be far better than any sort of spinning drives. Especially so performance like syncing in the cloud can sometimes be kind of gnarly just because a lot of times SQL Azure, for example, is not the world's fastest database server, and a lot of cloud servers are not using SSD. But in general, it's pretty fast.
Hi, Cam. This is Dilak. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you for the presentation. It's wonderful. I have experience in TDS. I have a question like now if we rename an item or a Sitecore item with the same name, maybe with different like if you rename a caps letter into simple letter, how does it conflict? Can we resolve those conflicts? Such things.
So like if you name something to be uppercase instead of lowercase?
Yeah.
Because the Windows file system is case insensitive, it will rename the case of the item on the file system, but that doesn't mean that it's going to show up automatically as a change in Git in the terms of the case, simply because it is not the file system isn't case sensitive. It will, however, change the name inside the item file itself, so the case will be set there, and so essentially you're set. It also handles, for example, if you've got two items of the same name and the same path, it knows how to disambiguate that by item ID. So if you have two items called, say, foo in the same folder, one of them will end up being foo _ item ID. It also understands long file names, like Windows has a path limit of 240 characters. And so if your item paths get long enough to the point where the default buffer plus the path to your item gets to be longer than that, it will actually do what's called a loopback path, which is sort of like what Sitecore serialization does, but what it is slightly easier to read than that because it loops back to the parent item GUID instead of a randomly generated hash that makes it really difficult to figure out what the parent item is. And we have a very important question from Kamruz Jaman. What happened to your beard? It's still here. It may not be as epic as it was in the infamous picture that goes around online, but
Hi, Cam.
Hi.
Is there any limitations on using this? I mean, if you, I have experience in TDS, so compared to that, is there any limitations? Or, I mean, is there anything that holds us using, Unicorn?
In terms of a sort of comparison with TDS, I think for daily development tasks, it's a little easier to use Unicorn just because so many things are automated. I think some of the things that they brought in TDS 5.5 with their autosync kind of bring around some of the more unicorny ideas to the way they're doing stuff. TDS also is a much larger product that sort of is multi-purpose. Like they have the ability to do their code gen stuff. They have update package generation and things built in. Unicorn just tries to do one thing, serialization and the deployment thereof. So it really depends on what you want. I mean, obviously Unicorn is free and open source. TDS is not.
Okay, so do we have options of generating packages in that case? If we really want to, the options.
If you want
Unicorn?
to generate update packages, there is a patch that Chris Van de Stieg did to Sitecore Courier, which is an update package generator that you can use to generate them in that sense. It's not really an update package generator in the same sense that Habitat was prior to it having Delta packages, in that it doesn't generate essentially an update package of all your serialized items in a single blob. But there's the capability there. You just have to bring in another tool with Courier, and then you could use Sage Sitecore Ship to deploy them if you wanted to. But personally, I'm a bigger fan of not using update packages. If you deploy your whole serialized state up to production with your code, that gives you a very easy reference point as to what everything should be set as.
And
Okay.
yeah,
Thanks,
and Cam, if someone wants to convert from TDS to Unicorn or Unicorn TDS, is this the same? They are using the same conversion mechanism for the files, like Sitecore serialization?
So they are using different formats. TDS is using the standard Sitecore serialization format, and Unicorn is using Rainbow. If you wanted to convert one way or the other, essentially you'd have to figure out what paths you had included and translate your TDS project with its includes of items into a Unicorn configuration that is by path. You can exclude child paths, and you can change your the way things sync per configuration. For example, a common thing people do in TDS is do deploy once. In Unicorn, that's using the new items only evaluator, which changes the way that syncs execute. When the sync is modified that way, it essentially only writes new items. So if the item already exists, it leaves it alone. So it essentially becomes an analog of deploy once. Let's see, people chatting on Hangouts here. All right, so I think that's about it. It sounds like questions are winding down at this point. So thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for your valuable.
Well, have a nice rest of your day, everybody.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you, Cam. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Have a good day. Bye. Bye-bye.